As 1990 began, the Wild Cowboys grew in size and continued to add new members as they began ruling the crack trade in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the South Bronx. One of those new additions to the squad was a brutal thug from the Bronx named Stanley Tukes. The hole at 348 Beekman Avenue was a well-oiled machine and earning major revenue. The gang implemented an efficient system of communication with the use of high-end walkie-talkies, which lookouts used to correspond with pitchers and managers with other subordinates. Along with the gang's rise in stature came an increase in the violence perpetrated against not only their rivals but innocent victims as well. As Lenny's prominence in the underworld escalated, so did his brutality, and along with having a squad of killers under his control, he had a frightening reputation and was dreaded by many in the streets. Frankie Cuevas' cocaine spot at Manor and Watson in the Soundview neighborhood was also doing well, and he had began including crack selling to his operation. From the start of 1990, bloodshed was being carried out at every turn by the Cowboys and their associates. On February 5th, Jose Feo Reyes, who was now one of the biggest kingpins in Washington Heights at only 20 years old, was involved in a shootout at the Mariscal del Caribe restaurant in the Bronx and was arrested for gun possession. On February 19, 1990, a Cowboys member named Funi was accused of shooting and killing a drug customer during a stick-up. On February 24th, Nelson accused one of his pitchers, a pregnant woman known as Lulu, of stealing from vials, and he shot her in the leg. On February 27th, manager Freddy Sendra was chased by police near the hole, and after engaging them in a shootout, he was arrested.
Soon after Freddy Sendra's arrest, Nelson came to visit him at the Bronx House of Detention, and while he was meeting with Freddy, Victor Mercedes spotted him. Victor yelled out to Nelson, threatening to kill him when he got out of prison for letting him and Pacualito languish since their arrests a few months earlier. Freddy would later be convicted of weapon possession and for aggravated assault on a peace officer and be sentenced to a 6 to 12-year prison term. Frankie Cuevas' own crew had grown substantially and included numerous Puerto Ricans he had met in prison and recruited to join him. Frankie earned the love and respect of his gang members, but was tremendously feared by others and was known to bully anyone he thought he could get over on. He would ask certain dealers to front him bricks of cocaine and never pay them back. He was also a heavy cocaine user, and when he was high on the drug, it would intensify his aggressive nature.
Frankie and Lenny continued to gallivant about the city together, and early one morning while driving home from the Mars Club in Lower Manhattan, they were cut off by another car, which led Lenny to shoot and wound both passengers with a .380 handgun.
By the spring of 1990, Frankie's drug operation at Manor and Watson was raking in the dough, and with some of his earnings, he arranged to purchase his favorite hangout, the 20 de Mayo restaurant, which once stood right behind me at West 173rd Street and St. Nicholas Avenue in Washington Heights. One evening, Frankie had the owner meet with him at one of his stash apartments, and after all contracts were signed, he paid the owner $250,000 in cash. The owner left the building with money in hand, and as he was entering his car, several armed men approached him and robbed him of the cash. The owner ran back into the apartment frantic, screaming to Frankie how he had just been robbed of all of his money. Frankie flew into a rage and called on his crew to get their guns and go out and find the thieves. But as it turns out, it was actually Frankie who sent his own men to rob the owner of the same cash he had just given him to purchase the restaurant. The owner was about to retire to DR and lost everything he had.
When El Feo noticed the profitability of Frankie's territory near Manor and Watson, he set up his own retail spots nearby, which led other dealers to follow suit. Frankie became enraged at this blatant infiltration of his turf, and one day he headed to Washington Heights in 2 tinted vehicles packed with gunmen to confront El Feo.
When Frankie pulled up to 167th in Amsterdam, El Feo happened to be with Lenny and Nelson, and they witnessed what was about to unfold and intervened to defuse the situation. Up until that point, Frankie was unaware of Lenny and Nelson's connection to El Feo, nor that they were reselling him his cocaine. but this incident made him question their loyalty to him. By now, Fat Danny wanted to get involved on a higher scale to make better profits for himself as well as for Pac and Victor. He wanted to set up his own operation at a spot just around the corner from 348 Beekman Avenue. Lenny wasn't very enthusiastic about this plan, but he eventually gave in and supplied Fat Danny with crack to open up a spot right here at 600 East 141st Street with Victor and Pac as his partners. Lenny's stipulations were stringent. The three had to pay him a high percentage of their earnings and also change the color of their vial tops to orange, as to not be confused with the red top crack on Beekman Avenue. The business did very modestly at first, but soon Danny began to tighten up his work ethic and make good business moves, and the orange top operation began to excel, and he opened up another chain on East 138th Street. Two local teens who began pitching for Danny were George Santiago, aka Seller, and Francisco Robles, known as Frankie.
Frankie had been involved with the gang since their days at Beach Terrace, when his apartment was used as a stash house and would come under Danny's wing. But there was another local hustler named Lefty Malave who was running his own crack operation just across the street at 593 East 141st Street, where he sold pink top vials. Danny's opening up of the orange top spot began to create tension between them, which would soon become a full-blown beef. One day, Cowboy soldier Edo D shot up the car of Lefty's younger brother Walter, and Lefty in turn set one of the Cowboys' cars on fire.
By now, the hole right here inside of 348 Beekman Avenue was a money gold mine, with sales occurring during all hours of the day and night, operating like a 24-hour supermarket for drug users. The organization would pull in as much as $250,000 in a single week from this location, as well as their other smaller chains, on track to pull in $12 million by the end of the year, over $28 million in today's money.
All right, that's Frankie with the white shirt, walking with the brown pants. That's Dave with the red shirt. The fat guy is Danny, and Rob over there getting in a car. They are notorious drug dealers. They hang on our block. We not gonna take the camera around the corner because they some fiending bastards. But you get a sample how many drug dealers is on this block.
Lenny was also a silent partner in a prominent marijuana business near 174th and Audubon in Washington Heights, which was ran by a man named Ruben Perez. It was the most popular weed spot in the Heights, and its clientele included well-known rappers. It attracted people from all over the city and outside of New York who traveled there to make purchases.
One day in late spring 1990, Lenny was out to hunt for drug turf intruders right around this area at the intersection of Manor and Watson. He jumped in a car driven by Platano, and in the back seat was Frankie's hitman Smiley, who Frankie would lend out to Lenny to handle matters as needed. When Smiley spotted one of the drug turf intruders from the back seat, he aimed his gun out the driver's side window, but as he was firing at his target, one of the bullets struck Platano in the back of his head. Platano was rushed to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery, but he eventually recovered from his wound. He was certainly suspicious about his shooting, as was Lenny, but Platano was told to let it go because it was just an accident, and he did for the time being. After his shooting, some people said that Platano changed for the worse and became even more aggressive. Then a few months after Platano was shot, on October 23, 1990, Danny and Smiley were together here on Beekman Avenue.
And that's when Smiley abruptly pulled out his gun and proceeded to shoot Danny 6 times.
Danny was taken to the hospital with critical injuries, but survived the shooting and went on to make a full recovery.
After this, Platano was sure that Smiley shooting him in the back of the head was no accident and concluded that Frankie Cuevas must be playing both sides. Lenny then gave Platano the go-ahead to kill Smiley. A few weeks later, they got word that he was heading to a birthday party in the Bronx. Platano and an accomplice arrived to the location and drove around until they spotted him. Then one of the gunmen shot at Smiley, but he was only grazed in the head, and afterwards he began to lay low. At this time, there was another vicious drug organization in Mott Haven named the C&C Gang, who was ruling just a short distance away from the hole on Brook Avenue. The gang was led by the brutal George Calderon and his cousin and second-in-command, Angel Cuson Padilla, and they extorted local drug dealers for a street tax to deal on their turf. C&C was comprised of mostly Puerto Ricans involved in heroin selling and may have been even more violent than the Cowboys. A few of Calderon's dealers on Brook Avenue also sold crack and were purchasing vials from the Hole and 141st.
Calderon had rode by Beekman Avenue on several occasions and noticed the Dominican kids on that block getting money, but had never attempted to extort them as they were outside of his turf and not competing with his mostly heroin business on Brook Avenue. From the very end of 1990 through the start of 1991, the Wild Cowboys were involved in a slew of violent incidents.
Manuel Lugo, known as Supra, had opened up a red top spot for Lenny at 2105 Vice Avenue in the Bronx. When another crack dealer named Carlos Ventura refused to stop selling in the same building, Supra reached out to Lenny for assistance. On December 30th, 1990, Lenny, Platano, Dominican Chino, and a Cowboys member named Lace went to Vice Ave and waited for Ventura to arrive.
Ventura pulled up in his car with his girlfriend Marilyn Colon, who was 7 months pregnant, and that's when Supra signaled to the others. Chino then hopped out of the vehicle and ran up to Ventura's car and started firing, striking him 5 times, and Marilyn was also struck once. Ventura died at the scene, and Marilyn was rushed to the hospital, where doctors were able to save her baby girl by delivering the child via C-section, but Marilyn died the following day.
The next day, on New Year's Eve, 1990, Stanley Tukes was in a building when he got into an argument with a man named Quentin Lee after he bumped into him coming off of an elevator, and he shot him 5 times, seriously wounding him. 10 days later, it's alleged that members of the Cowboys abducted a man named Quincy Norwood and killed him by setting him on fire at St. Mary's Park. Then the following week, for reasons that aren't clear, Tuke shot a man named Nathan Wilder 7 times, leaving him permanently blind from his injuries. By now, Edo D, Dominican Chino, and Stanley were running closely together, and the trio earned the nickname within their crew as the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a reference to the famous Western film.
On March 3rd, 1991, at around 2 a.m., Platano was sent to kill an 18-year-old crack dealer named Pedro Lopez near Walton Avenue in the Bronx. Platano shot him several times, critically wounding him. However, one of his stray bullets struck a 14-year-old girl named Litza Rivera in the chest, who was coming out of a restaurant with her aunt. Rivera died in the hospital a few hours later. A week later, a man named Johnny Richards had approached El Feo right here at 167th in Amsterdam and told him that his 2 rivals, Angel Santana, known as Morenito, and his half-brother, Victor Batista, known as Pelo, had offered him a $25,000 contract to kill him. Richards told him that he would reverse the contract if he doubled the payment, but El Feo blatantly rejected his offer, and Richards, feeling disrespected by his dismissal, shot El Feo in the leg. One of El Feo's henchmen was standing right next to him and immediately intervened and began grappling with Richards and took a shot to the shoulder during the process, but wrestled the gun away from him and shot Richards 3 times, then followed him into the middle of Amsterdam Avenue where he finished him off. That henchman was Francisco Medina, a recent immigrant from the Dominican Republic, who would become better known in the streets as Freddy Krueger.
Francisco Medina came to Washington Heights looking for work with El Feo. He had heard about him from his half-brother and some friends from his hometown of Hato Nuevo who were already working for him. When El Feo's boss, Rogelio Chocolate Perez, was released from prison in 1990, he set him and Medina up at 1770 Andrews Avenue in the Bronx, where they sold a variety of drugs, making good profits. But soon Medina would find his real niche. In October of 1990, El Feo offered $3,000 to anyone willing to get rid of a worker of his named James Tolson, who was accused of snitching. Medina jumped on the offer. Soon afterwards, he found Tolson in his apartment and shot him dead. The following month, Medina was the accomplice who joined Platano to hunt down and shoot Smiley. From there on out, Medina became El Feo's bodyguard and top triggerman, and he would also put in heavy work with the Wild Cowboys. At around 6'2", 230 pounds, he had a large machete scar from one side of his stomach to the other. He emptied his gun out on his targets, shooting them at least 10 times, and also kept a bottle of Remy Martin with him to toast after each hit. He was a brujo, meaning witch doctor in Spanish, and practiced the African witchcraft brujeria, and performed ritual baths, believing it would protect him from being killed or arrested. As the ruthless assassin continued to pile up bodies, he earned the nickname Freddy Krueger, named after the fictional movie villain who came to you in your dreams, because like the character, Medina was your worst nightmare.
On May 18, 1991, the crew's gun supplier, Crazy Ray Polanco, agreed to meet Lenny in Manhattan later that night to give him an Uzi that he had prepaid $2,500 for. That evening, Lenny, Nelson, Platano, Frankie Cuevas, and several others headed to the Palladium nightclub on 14th Street. After they left the club at around 4 a.m., Lenny met with Raymond Polanco nearby to retrieve his Uzi, and he planned to test it out on the highway during the ride home. During the drive back, the men were spread out between 3 cars. Lenny and Raymond Polanco were in a burgundy Buick sedan, Nelson and Platano were in a white BMW, and Frankie Cuevas, Madonna, and another friend named Edwin Herrera were in an older model Chevy.
After leaving the Palladium, the crew headed west to check the let-out at the Limelight Club on 6th Avenue and 20th Street. Afterwards, they all continued on 6th Avenue with Platano in the lead and drove north for several miles. When they got to West 57th Street, they turned left to go towards the West Side Highway. Platano hit a red light at the highway entrance. Then when the light turned green, he proceeded. As he turned right up the highway ramp, a red pickup truck ran through a red light at the intersection and almost collided with him before continuing up the West Side Highway.
Platano then slowed down and waited for his followers to catch up to him. Then he expressed rage to the others at nearly being hit.
So all the cars sped up after the pickup truck. The truck was occupied by 3 young white males from Tarrytown, New York, and when the driver realized he was being chased, he floored it. Lenny had Ray pull the Uzi from under the seat and give it to him, as Lenny now felt that he had the opportune moment to test it out. As Polanco caught up to them, Lenny aimed at the vehicle and fired, but the gun jammed. Then he gave it to Polanco to fix as the cars continued speeding past the 125th Street exit. Polanco adjusted the clip, then gave it back to him, and Lenny fired again, this time emptying out the entire clip on the pickup truck.
The driver, 20-year-old David Cargill, was struck in the head and chest. Mortally wounded, he slumped over in the vehicle as his friend seated next to him grabbed the wheel to try to bring the truck to a stop, as the pursuing cars then sped past them and continued on. His friends put David in the passenger seat, then they exited the highway and drove through the local streets until they spotted an ambulance, who then took David to Harlem Hospital. David Cargill was pronounced dead on arrival, while his assailants then headed to another club in the Bronx. Detective Gary Dugan from Homicide North was soon on site to investigate the killing. Dugan was considered a proficient homicide detective and regularly worked with other precincts in Manhattan to help them solve murders. Cargill's friends explained that they were being chased by a white BMW and several other cars full of dark-skinned Hispanics when they were fired upon. But detectives initially didn't believe the story from the 2 passengers about a random shooting on the highway by a car full of Hispanic men. Then when the kids later admitted that they had purchased cocaine in Washington Heights, Before they headed to downtown Manhattan to search for prostitutes, the detectives became even more suspicious about their stories and the reasons behind the shooting. Soon, names of Wild Cowboys members would surface as being the culprits, but the investigation would take many twists and turns after numerous varying accounts of the incident arose.
Cargill's murder would turn out to be one of the biggest New York homicide investigations of the decade. Some other members of the Wild Cowboys included Russell Harris, aka Rennie, and Rafael Perez, known as Teso, who mainly worked as Lenny's driver but was also used to carry out hits. By now, El Feo was more involved in cocaine dealing and was one of the main connects who the Sepulvedas were getting work from. El Feo continued using Freddy Krueger to keep things in line for him, and Freddy also became a favorite trigger man of Lenny and Nelson. Freddy was also taking a teenager named Raul Vargas on missions to learn the trade, and Vargas would soon become El Feo's driver.
After two men known as Mengolo and Pascal had double-crossed El Feo, Freddy Krueger was sent to make them disappear. On June 2, 1991, Pascal was spotted near West 174th Street in Washington Heights. Freddy then followed him in a car to 175th and Audubon, then fired at him from the vehicle, striking him several times. Pascal dropped to the ground badly wounded and tried to crawl for cover, and that's when Freddy hopped out of the vehicle, ran up to him, and shot him several more times at close range. Pascal initially survived, but was paralyzed from the neck down, and eventually succumbed to his wounds, dying a few months later in the hospital. Pascal's partner Mengolo was missing in action, but his time would soon come. 2 days after the shooting of Pascal, Lenny sent Platano and Freddy to a location in the Bronx where Smiley was spotted hanging out. They were being driven by an associate named Meow Meow, who circled the block for several hours until Smiley finally appeared with a friend. Then Freddy and Platano hopped out of the vehicle, ran up to them, and started unloading their weapons, killing Smiley on the spot and wounding his friend Fresh in the process. This hit was ostensibly carried out as revenge for Smiley's attempted murders on both Platano and Danny. But unbeknownst to Fat Danny at the time, it was actually Lenny who ordered Smiley to shoot him. The idea to eliminate Danny came with a little persuasion from Frankie Cuevas, who sensed that Lenny wanted him out of the picture. Danny's orange top business did better than expected and started cutting into Lenny's red top sales at 348 Beekman Avenue, and Lenny worried that Danny was getting too big for his own good. Then when the heat came down on Smiley for shooting Fat Danny, Lenny ordered Platano to get rid of Smiley in order to cover his tracks. Although Lenny and Frankie were friends on the surface, there was an unspoken rivalry between them, and the fact that Lenny suspected that Frankie had Smiley intentionally shoot Platano in the back of his head, this was also a way to send a message to Frankie that he was the man in charge.
At this same time, the beef between Lefty and the Orange Top crew of the Cowboys had escalated. Someone close to Lefty had shot and killed a man on Beekman Avenue who was associated with the Cowboys. Afterwards, a dealer of Lefty's named Ivan Lugo was killed after being shot over 20 times by Freddy Krueger near 593 East 141st, which may have been a case of mistaken identity. After this, Lefty went to speak with Cuson, who was a family friend that came from his same hometown of Salina, Puerto Rico. He explained the situation and asked Cuson for some reinforcement, and he agreed to help him out. Victor and Pacualito were released from prison on August 13, 1991 due to an adjournment for the double murder of Tito and Chico from September of 1989. They were harboring resentment at being abandoned by Lenny and Nelson for nearly 2 years after avenging Miguelito's death for them.
The men then decided to rejoin the Red Top Ring, and to settle his differences with Victor and Pacualito, Lenny gave them a few kilos of cocaine and stacks of cash. Lenny was intent on resolving this matter because he was about to serve an 8-month sentence for a gun possession charge and wanted to make sure that things were running smoothly while he was gone. By now, there were tensions growing between Frankie and Lenny, and although Lenny had reason to be wary of Frankie's dubious moves, they were both benefiting greatly from each other's operations, and thus Lenny tolerated him for the time being. El Feo had also began to serve an 8-month prison term for a gun possession charge, and Freddy Krueger and Chocolate stepped in to run things while he was gone. During this time, Freddy would also be heavily involved as an assassin for the Wild Cowboys.
There was an old friend of Lenny's that he grew up with known as Black Miguel, who was one of the plugs that used to sell him kilos of coke. Miguel had also been supplying the Orange Top crew with work and allegedly made other business deals in the area without Lenny's knowledge, perhaps with the belief that his relationship with him gave him an unspoken permission to work his turf.
However, Black Miguel had either overestimated his friendship with Lenny or underestimated his viciousness.
One day, Miguel was near the bottom of a staircase which leads up to a dead-end block called Oak Terrace, which is just across the street from 348 Beekman, when Lenny approached him and shot him in the stomach.
Other Cowboys members heard the gunshot and came outside to find Miguel exclaiming how Lenny had shot him, and they stood by his side until the ambulance arrived. Many Puerto Ricans in Mott Haven disliked the group of Dominicans who muscled in on their neighborhood, and there were people who wanted to oust the Wild Cowboys. To compound this, one day in September of 1991, Platano was accused of shooting and damaging the car of someone who belonged to the CNC gang. The car owner then went to 600 East 141st Street asking for Platano, but the Cowboys members who were outside pretended like they had no idea who he was, and after a brief argument, the car owner said he would be back. When word of this got back to Cuson, he assembled a small army to finally go send a message to those Dominicans on Beekman Avenue.
Cuson sent Lefty around 24 strapped CNC enforcers, and Lefty then led the charge to Beekman Avenue. They tried to pull off a sneak attack by going up the staircases to the dead-end block which leads to the front of 348 Beekman. But the troop was spotted turning down the side street beforehand, and the Cowboys were ready for them. The two crews engaged in a wild gun battle in front of the building. Also joining the Wild Cowboys to back them up were members of the local Blue Thunder heroin crew who were rivals to the CNC gang. During the firefight, there were hundreds of rounds exchanged. Once the smoke settled, miraculously there were no fatalities or serious wounds on either side.
No area residents called the cops, and by the time that the police even became aware of the incident and arrived to the scene sometime later, the Cowboys were nowhere to be found, and there were hundreds of shell casings on the ground. The cops didn't even bother to write up vouchers and swept the shell casings into the sewer drains.
On October 7, 1991, Lenny began to serve his prison term, and Nelson became the acting boss in his absence. Almost as soon as Lenny went in, Red Top and Orange Top sales began to plummet. Additionally, a young hustler named Gerard Hurd had set up an operation in an alleyway down the street from the hole at 320 Beekman Avenue, which sold crack in Yellow Top vials. He and his group were known as the Yellow Top Crew and began selling $3 vials called trays, which were allegedly just as good as the Red Top's $5 vials, and led the Wild Cowboys to lose even more business. While Lenny was locked up, Frankie sent his crony and former Cowboys member Madonna to sell heroin near Beekman Avenue. When the Cowboys uncovered this, Victor approached Madonna and beat him with a chair leg, and Stanley nearly shot him. Soon afterwards, Frankie came to Beekman Avenue with his entourage, and Pac confronted him with his own crew. Frankie told Pac that Lenny had given him permission to sell there, but Pac told him that there's no way he's selling in their territory, even if it was heroin. After Frankie noticed Ed O.D. standing off to the side with his hand on his gun, he and his crew backed off and left the block.
It was later surmised that Frankie's heroin pitch was just a ruse to make him think that he wouldn't be competing with their crack operation when he was really intent on taking it over. They also knew that had Frankie been allowed to sell there, he would have had all of them killed.
With tensions already accumulating between the two alpha personalities trying to be the more dominant drug lord, the acrimony between Lenny and Frankie exploded into a full-blown beef, leading them to become mortal enemies. Frankie began pulling up to blocks in the Heights with members of his entourage and would assault people just because they were associates of Lenny's, and sometimes even smacked men in front of their ladies. Soon people lived in complete fear of Cuevas and vacated the blocks to avoid encountering him. By December of 1991, Gerard Heard's Yellow Top crew continued to cut into business at The Hole and East 141st, but not enough to cause any significant loss of income for either location, since both were thriving. But Nelson still felt that they were a threat to his operation since they were so close by, so he sent Platano, Stanley, and Linwood to beat up or rob Yellow Top workers on several occasions. However, Heard was unwilling to back down.
Nelson then went upstate to speak with Lenny about the situation, and for reasons that aren't clear, Lenny was against having Heard killed and said that he would deal with it after he was released from prison. But Nelson felt obligated to act in order to prove his fortitude and was intent on making a big statement. On the evening of December 16, 1991, about a dozen people were gathered in the alleyway right behind me at 320 Beekman Avenue, including 17-year-old pitcher Anthony "Amp" Green. Two cars occupied by several men pulled up and asked Amp to come speak with them. After a short exchange of words, Amp turned around and walked away, and that's when several men hopped out of the vehicles with MAC-10s and began shooting up the entire alleyway. As the crowd scurried for cover, 5 people were mowed down by the gunfire.
Killed on the spot were 38-year-old Manuel Vera, who was shot 14 times. A 32-year-old crack addict named Cynthia Casado died clutching a vial in her hand. And a male who has never been identified. Soon, a commotional scene of police and ambulances flooded Beekman Avenue. Anthony "Amp" Green had several gunshot wounds and lay on the ground critically wounded.
Amp Green's older brother Chubby arrived to the location to find his brother clinging to life, and he stood by his side as he was rushed to the hospital, where he later died. A drug customer at the scene named Janice Brewington was the only one who was struck by gunfire and survived. This quadruple homicide came to be known by the 40th Precinct as the Quad. And this heinous slaughter, in addition to the murder of innocent college student David Cargill on the highway, had put tremendous pressure on lead investigator Mark Tebbens. With the 40th Precinct being overwhelmed by these murders and many others, Tebbens was soon being assisted by other precincts and agencies to help bring down these cowboys running wild on Beekman Avenue.
He worked alongside the HIU, the Homicide Investigation Unit, as well as with detectives involved in the high-intensity drug trafficking areas known as HIDTA. Some of the other detectives working to bring down the gang included Raymond Aguiar, Wilfredo Benitez, Lori Griefa, and Terry Quinn. Assistant DA Walter Arsenault was the chief of the HIU. Fernando Camacho, who was an expert on Dominican gangs and involved in several high-profile cases, was the chief trial counsel assigned to the HIU. But along with Tebbens, the HIU would also later be accused of many misdeeds and unlawful tactics from their investigations in numerous cases.
A break came when Chubby agreed to assist detectives in identifying members of the gang. He sat alongside Tebbens in a surveillance vehicle stationed near the hole and identified members of the crew as they came and went. When a man appeared who Chubby knew as Dark Man, which was actually Platano, he identified him to Tebbens as one of the men he overheard as being one of the quad shooters. After Platano and another man got into a vehicle and drove off, Tebbens radioed to nearby police officers to arrest them, and after a short car chase, Platano got away. Around the same time, investigators in Manhattan had received their first break in the Cargill murder from a confidential informant in Washington Heights. They told them that a dark-skinned Hispanic man known on the streets as Platano had bragged about the killing, but it was yet to be determined that this was the same man being sought in the Quad investigation. Police began kicking things into high gear to bring down the Wild Cowboys, but even with all of their egregious acts, their brutal reputation made witnesses fearful to come forward, and their efficiently structured operation at the Hole made it hard to infiltrate. But the crooked cop, Mark Tebbens, was going to use whatever underhanded tactics he needed to in order to make a case against the gang. A thief and low-level drug dealer named James Singleton identified Stanley Tukes and Shorty Gonzalez as two of the shooters. An intellectually impaired, crack-addicted woman named Martha Molina claimed to have seen Platano and Stanley. Quad survivor Janice Brewington was a homeless crack addict and gave details of the incident but couldn't identify the assailants.
Mark Tebbens and other investigators began using whoever they could to make evidence fit wherever they needed it to. They were using so-called eyewitnesses to help them tie every violent crime that occurred on or around Beekman Avenue back to the Wild Cowboys. Even when crack users in the area were viciously assaulted, the gang would be blamed for it, even though it was usually the result of an ongoing war between addicts. At a time when the Wild Cowboys' secure and lucrative drug dealing operation should have continued to flourish, they instead brought tremendous heat on themselves and their business from a succession of unnecessary murders. Lenny's senseless killing of David Cargill and Nelson's call for the excessive slaughter of 4 innocent people had severely backfired, and these incidents were the catalyst for many problems to come for the gang.